What's up guys, Xell here, and today we're going to be talking about OP06. We are a week in, and we're kind of seeing what the meta is looking like already. Of course, we already know what things were like in Japan, but I wanted to talk about the meta in the form of a tier list. Here's the thing, with this tier list, I'm not going to go over every single leader. I think that's just a waste of time for everybody because I don't know anything about some of these leaders, and honestly, most of the times they just kind of play the same packages as the top tier leaders do. They just have worse leader abilities in general, so I don't feel like it's worth it to go over that, but instead I'm going to be talking about this tier list in the form, or I guess I should say the context of how likely this deck will do at a really big tournament. So things I value really highly are things like consistency and just general matchup spread. So with that, let's get started. All right, let's start with the very tippy top. I don't know which deck necessarily is better at the top, which is kind of crazy to say, but I think there's a clear top two. So I think the top two decks this format are Sakazuki and Moria. I think these two decks are far and away the best of the best. And the reason why I say that is, again, I think that these decks have really high consistency, and on top of that, I think they have a really great matchup spread. So let's talk about it individually, and I'll talk about why I think it's a little hard to order these two. So Sakazuki, we've seen him a lot in OP05. We already kind of know what he's strong at. He's got that discard draw ability, which is insane. It gets even better this set because now we use our graveyard even more with things like the 8-cost Moria, I should say. And overall, bottom decking is stronger than ever this set because so many of the characters that people play these days are things that are difficult to KO or things that you don't want to KO. So, for example, we have the Moria stuff, which generally, if you KO a Perona, he's just going to bring it back, and then you have to discard another card. So you want to bottom deck that. Moria's just generally, you kind of want to bottom deck as much things as you can with him. Same thing with stuff like the Reiju decks. If you kill one of the big guys like Ichiji and they have the baby form in hand, then they just play it and now you gotta deal with it again. The yellow deck's got Okiku, so generally speaking, there's just a lot of really sticky characters this set, and having bottom decking as part of your arsenal is just really strong. And so Sakazuki is just one of the things where both parts of his color identity are just keeping him as the top tier of the top tier, on top of the fact that the discard draw makes him incredibly consistent. The only reason why I think that it's a little contentious with Moria is that his heads up matchup into some of the top tiers are a little bit, let's just say, funky. You would think that against Moria that because he has the bottom decking in his arsenal, that the Moria matchup would be favored towards Sakazuki. But I think after testing, I think at best it's 50-50. I think Moria is just one of those decks that, because of the rate in which he mills, a lot of times, even if you bottom deck his stuff, he kind of just has the tools necessary anyways. And on top of that, if you get into the fights where you are dropping Moria and Ice Age back and forth, or Moria stage, whatever, build of Sakazuki you're playing, you get into these back and forth Moria fights. Well, the thing is, Moria can actually search the Morias, which is kind of important, right? Hogback takes it from his graveyard and puts it back into hand, whereas Sakazuki, you don't get that privilege, let's put it. And so I think there are certain things that Moria has that can make the matchup difficult for Sakazuki. But that said, Sakazuki's base power level is just so high, and so he gets his game plan off so consistently that it's hard for me to put any Sakazuki anything lower than the top two decks. I think generally what me and my friends have been saying is that Moria is the consistent deck that you will top with, but Sakazuki is the deck that feels more likely to win it. Let's talk about Moria. So Moria is also just insane. So there's a couple things that are going for him that make him such a great leader. One is the fact that he's at 5 life. 5 life is really, really relevant right now because of the existence of Yamato. Yamato just preys on 4 life leaders super heavily, and being 5 life makes it that much harder for Yamato. On top of that, I think Moria has a bit of an easier matchup into yellow in particular because Moria can go wide, can attack the hand. They're just really annoying for yellow to deal with because of how quickly they can outvalue you in the long run. Most decks against Katakuri, you can't play the long game because the threat of Big Mom is so high. And it's still that way for the most part with Moria too, but Moria, I feel has a better time dealing with that stuff than some of these other decks. Moria in general, I think also just holds down more matchups than I think Sakazuki even does. I think like a lot of the aggro decks in general, not just Yamato, but like Zoro, Whitebeard, whatever, like into Moria, I think it's just very difficult. And yeah, so Moria's just really high value. You just are this kind of like unstoppable brick wall, and you run more 2Ks than Sakazuki, so defensively you're just kind of harder to end the game on top of the fact that you're 5 life. So yeah, Moria's just really, really powerful, and I see him and Sokka as the top 2 very clearly. I would say the next deck that kind of rounds out our 3 best decks of the format. Like, I think after this, there's a bit of a drop-off, but Katakuri is, again, just a absolute menace this set as well. Katakuri is an interesting deck this time around because they got a lot of new tools, but at the cost of, I think, consistency. They no longer run as many Big Mom Pirates cards, and so cards like Perospero and Pudding, like, I've never seen Pudding whiff so many times than this set's Katakuri list. Like, it's crazy. But Katakuri gets a lot of new tools with Okiku, and the card that I think is just the most ridiculous thing ever is Reject. And I think between some of the new tools that Katakuri gets, I think this the floor of power that's in Katakuri is just higher than it's ever been before. And just in general, of course, with the sort of yellow life stuff that happens around Katakuri, you know, he's able to win basically unwinnable games, and on the converse of that, the reverse side of that, he can also lose games that feel unlosable too. Like Katakuri, I think more than ever kind of lacks consistency, which is I know that's kind of silly to say because like I think most of us understand that Katakuri has always been kind of the casino deck. But I think it's even weirder now because like the highers feel even higher, but the lowers sometimes feel even lower. So Katakuri, I think in the sense like of a big tournament, like I still think that the floor of the power floor of the deck is still high enough that you'll do consistently well at these tournaments. However, you are going to just lose some matches randomly here and there due to like bad triggers in life or just being completely bricked out. So Katakuri, I just don't think it's not in the same tier as the top 2 decks, but I still think it's quite good to bring to these big events. On top of that, it's a very simple deck. I think before you could play kind of a more hybrid game where you don't have to be as aggro, but I think with the new cards, it benefits Katakuri to be even more linear than ever and just kind of smash face because you are just able to more efficiently close out games with stuff like Amaru and Reject. So really liking Katakuri as a deck right now. It's really, really powerful. Okay, so then so after Katakuri, I think the deck power or just like consistency starts to get a little bit lower. I'm gonna talk about Yamato first. I think Yamato's a really interesting leader because you can build it in a couple different ways, right? Like we have the Wano build, the Fortress build, and the Sky Island package. And it kind of depends, like in terms of what you want to build, it just kind of depends on what you want to build for and like what you expect the meta to be. I think Yamato is, by the way, like the locals farming deck. Like if you know your locals and you can tune the deck to your locals, the deck is absolutely insane. So like, for example, if your meta is very yellow heavy, Fortress Yamato is absolutely bonkers. Like Katakuri struggles into that wall, and even in the match, the mirror matches, like if your opponent's on Sky Island or something, like Kid is just such a menace to deal with, and you know, Katakuri again doesn't run the A-cost Katakuris very much anymore, and so Yamato just the Kid just becomes such a problem. That said, if your meta is full of 4 life leaders like Sakazuki or something, or Reiju or something like that, Sky Island is just so difficult for lots of decks to deal with. Like the speed at which you're able to pressure someone's life is just unparalleled, and like I think Sakazuki's one truly bad matchup in this set is the Sky Island Yamato, and yeah, so like if you expect to see a lot of Sakazuki, I think Yamato Sky Island is a great deck to bring. Wano, I haven't seen that successful of Wano builds yet, so can't comment on that. It doesn't feel as strong into some of these other decks. But I think I really like the flexibility of Yamato, and it kind of depends on like what you see the meta as. But in these big 9 Swiss round tournaments, I think Yamato, just the fact that you'll see a lot of different decks makes it a little more difficult, and the fact that Yamato just you don't have a way to build that makes you good against all three of the top three decks. You can kind of like pick and choose which one that you want to be a little bit better against. But then you end up being weak against the reverse side. So I think Yamato just isn't quite there, but is kind of a gatekeeper in a lot of ways. So I want to talk about my next favorite deck of the set, which is Perona. Perona is a deck that I kind of underrated going into the set. Obviously, everyone talks about its yellow matchup being miserable, but honestly, the yellow matchup is bad, but it's not as bad as I think people have said in the past. Like, people kind of talked about it as being unwinnable, and maybe against Yamato, I feel like the Sky Island Yamato, I feel more that way, but in the regular, Perona builds, like, I think you're running the 10 cost Doflamingos, and the Doflamingo chain is still just a really powerful finisher against like any deck. And so I still think Perona still has a high power ceiling, and the fact that Perona naturally has a really good matchup into Moria is also really strong for her. The other thing that makes Perona kind of a weaker pick in these longer tournaments is the fact that Perona doesn't have a consistent game plan. Like, of course, you're trying to rest the 4-cost stuff, but I think the most important card in the deck oftentimes is your Ryumas, and your Ryumas aren't searchable, and that's a really big negative to Perona. She also doesn't have the same sort of ability to put things in the graveyard the way Sakazuki and Moria do, so she doesn't really abuse the 8-cost Moria nearly to the same extent. So it's just kind of awkward a little bit with Perona. Like, when I've built her, I really like the Inupe build over the brand new build. You go down a card compared to brand new, but you're able to sculpt your hand a little bit more, specifically to what you need. You can keep those Ryumas in hand versus like brand news, you'll always put Ryuma into the yard. So I don't know. Perona, a little underrated. We'll see. I feel like Moria is a popular deck, and I think with like a good bit of luck, Perona, if you make it to the Moria side of the tournament, like, you can do really, really well. I think her matchup into Sakazuki is terrible though, and sort of holds her back. And Katakuri is also not a great matchup. So I think Perona it's just a little bit of a tough spot. It kind of just depends on what you think you'll be seeing. Other decks I think are pretty strong. Reiju, I initially underrated this deck going into OP06. I think this deck is just very hard to pilot effectively. And right now, Reiju, I feel like it's just a game of how many... First of all, you're playing multiple mini games. Does your opening hand have a stage in it? If not, you're in trouble. How many Ichiji's do you see in the game? If you see 2+ Ichiji, you're doing pretty well. If you don't see Ichiji, you're doing really poorly. So like, the deck oftentimes feels like you're searching madly for these cards that you need, and you spend all your time searching, and you don't actually progress the game into a state that's actually beneficial to you. And it might be just pilot error. I think this is a deck that has like a tremendously high skill ceiling, and I think this is a deck that might do better as time goes on, because I do think like finding a proactive game plan can be, weighing that against like trying to find the right pieces seems like just you gotta find the right line with Reiju, and it can be pretty difficult. There's so many game actions that you take with Reiju, but it sometimes feels like you're just like going through your deck, you're doing all these game actions, trying to find things, and then you just died because your opponent, meanwhile, has just been like punching you in the face while you're trying to find answers to things or like ways to progress the board. So I don't know. I think Reiju, the ceiling on this deck is very high, but it's just about the consistency of actually seeing the pieces that you need. Next deck that I think is also, again, underrated is Enel. I think a lot of people sort of just pushed aside Enel. I can see why, because the 8-cost Moria is it's kind of difficult, right, for Enel. Like, Enel's this guy who really wants to keep the board clear, so that way it's hard for you to take his last life. But then Moria spits out 3 bodies on the board very efficiently, and so you would think that would be really bad for Enel. And it is, don't get me wrong, but I still think Enel has a lot of tricks up his sleeve. The fact that if he high rolls and gets a lot of his late game, because, you know, again, Enel sort of suffers from the fact that he is a yellow leader, so you need good triggers, but also the fact that your top end is mostly unsearchable. Like, it just means like his game plan just isn't very consistent right now. You're kind of hoping to draw into the things that you need. But that said, if you do, the deck is still just as strong as it was in OP05. You know, and I think like it has really good matchups into some of the other tier decks. Like, I think it's good into Yamato, for example. Yamato, I think, really hates the fact that he gets a life back after you put him down to 0. Stuff like that makes Enel kind of tricky. And yeah, I don't know. So like, I think out of the top tier decks, like, I think Moria might struggle the most into Enel, because Enel just kind of brick walls Moria, and you get a more value out of things like Gedatsu and Yamato when your opponent's on a 5-life leader. And like Katakuri into Enel too. Like, Enel, I don't think is necessarily favored in that matchup, but I don't think it's that bad for Enel either. It's really Sakazuki, I feel like, that really puts down Enel. But yeah, I don't know. I think this deck probably needs to be taken a look at again. I think if I was to order this by power, maybe somewhere along this line. I don't know. I think Enel is kind of underrated and could be a good pick still. Red Purple Law. This deck, you know, if you've been paying attention to the Japanese meta, this deck becomes basically tier 1 in EBO1/OP07. It gets a bunch of new tools, so I kind of see the deck as like a little bit unfinished right now. And even in its unfinished state, it's still kind of a menace to deal with. Like, the addition of the 4-cost Reiju card gives Law a little bit more longevity. Like, the biggest issue that the deck had was the fact that, you know, you're oftentimes going down in cards to deal with your opponent's cards, and then suddenly you don't have as much Dawn to work with, and like, you kind of have to crawl yourself back out of these things. But that said, Reiju helps a lot in that regard, because you get to refuel your hand quite frequently, and you can sustain pressure better than you could from before. But yeah, I don't know. The deck is very powerful. I still think that it still suffers in some ways. Like, I just feel like it just needs a little more pieces for it to be really, really good. Like, I think it actually has a pretty decent matchup into Sakazuki in particular. But randomly, like, you're kind of gatekept by some of the lower tier decks. Like, I think the Perona matchup feels kind of miserable because you only play 4 costs for the most part. So Perona just sits there, and you know, you just get starved out against Perona. Yamato also just reverses that pressure, and like, you know, you have blockers in the Red Purple Law deck, but man, being a 4-life leader into Yamato is really brutal. And of course, I think decks like Enel or Katakuri and Moria being 5-life leader. I think actually his matchup into Katakuri is quite decent because you can spam the board quite well. But Moria in particular, just a big guy, hard to deal with. But yeah, I don't know. It's like you just I think this deck just mostly suffers from consistency is, I think, the main issue that keeps it back. Like, I'm thinking about it now, and like a lot of the matchups into the top tiers don't look that bad on paper for Red Purple Law, but it's just like over the course of 9 rounds, like, are you going to constantly be able to see the answers that you need to? Red Purple Law, kind of like Sakazuki, you just have a bottom decking thing that is really good in the current meta. So I don't know, maybe Red Purple Law is better than I think. It also completely invalidates Reiju as a deck, which is kind of funny. Kind of sad for Reiju stands if you ever queue up into a Red Purple Law, because Reiju wants to be at lower Dawn than your opponent, but Law is like, my ability -3s me, so there's no chance that you ever get underneath the amount of Dawn that Law has. Next deck I want to talk about is Uta. Uta's is kind of the same thing as Red Purple Law, where I feel like it isn't a complete deck necessarily. You know, missing the Sanji, the 2K film searcher from the next couple sets, and Uta just kind of gets more and more tools, and even without those tools, kind of like Red Purple Law, still kind of a scary deck to deal with. You have a good matchup into the yellow decks, being a 5-life leader, and most Uta decks run the 8-cost Kid, which just, like, again, yellow decks just hate that card so much. And on top of that, like, you are just able to flood the board really fast. So against decks like Sakazuki and Moria, like you really have to see your removal and your shrink and all that stuff to really be able to deal with the Uta pressure. And Uta is one of the rare few decks right now that deals with Sabo cleanly. Like most decks right now outside of Sakazuki, I would say, and I guess to a lesser extent Perona, because you can -1 Brook Sabos, but like Sabo is so annoying for many decks to deal with, and Uta's backlight just, you know, gets him out of the way for just 2 Dawn for lethal swings is really powerful. So I don't know where to order B, honestly. I think in some ways Yamato is clearly the 4th best in my opinion, and then like from Perona on, it feels kind of hard to order what I think is the best. If I had to make a best guess for where I think the decks are, I would rate it like this as of right now. I definitely think as players get better, Reiju will go up in stonks, and maybe like Uta a little bit lower, and maybe Enel gets a little lower as people remember how to play and deal with Enel better. But yeah. And then C tier, I'm just gonna put in our old our old kings of the game who once terrorized everybody. The red aggro decks just didn't get as many tools as some of the other colors did. You know, like black got Moria, obviously. Yellow got stuff like Okiku. I think like green decks have always been kind of good into red with the existence of 8-cost Kid. So in a lot of ways, like the aggro decks just kind of naturally fell to the side, especially on the red side. But they're still okay. You know, Whitebeard actually won a regional recently. Like I like Whitebeard, and specifically Whitebeard compared to these other two. Like Whitebeard just naturally is such a powerful deck. Like on like even if the cards aren't good right now, just being a 6K leader and just being able to consistently see your game plan is just a really. Those are just really 2 good things in a leader. Like I think Whitebeard is just like on base level, just one of the strongest leaders around, and can really mess with a lot of people's game plan being at 6K. Zoro, you know, I think Zoro and Law both just struggle from black decks being so good, and like they want to play all these small guys, but everyone just keeps messing with their stuff. And I think Zoro has a little bit better than Law because Zoro can just play a bunch of rushers and try to get value from his stuff before they die. Whereas Law is kind of stuck trying to build a board before he can actually do anything. Like, I feel like sometimes when you play Law, you're like, man, I'm just playing a vanilla 4-life leader because I never get to use the effect because my board dies so much. I'm actually going to put Nami above these two here. I think I feel like Nami is just permanently one of those decks that like chump check people. People don't know how to play into Nami a lot or are like really inefficient into it. And Nami did get a couple cards here. I think they got White Snake as one of the new cards that are quite good in the deck. But I think overall, Nami still isn't great. You know, I think Sakazuki in particular is still a rough matchup. Katakuri can be kind of rough depending on how many 10 mobs they see. Just like Nami is kind of actually similar to the yellow decks, and like you want really good triggers and good proactive plays. So I feel like Nami's one of those decks that can just kind of high roll, randomly win, but then also randomly lose. So Nami is like a really extreme Katakuri in that way. And so for these big tournaments, I would put a little bit lower because I think that the deck just lacks a little bit of that consistency to be able to proactively mill yourself and get that dub. So yeah, so these are the decks that I think are the most relevant in the OP06 meta. It's pretty neat to see that the meta has opened up quite a bit. You know, I think last set I would have only basically put like maybe 5 decks on here in terms of relevance to the meta. But I think these are all decks that you could reasonably see at a regional level. Maybe this like Zoro and Law actually deserve to be even lower. But I think these are kind of ordered in the likelihood that they top, and yeah, so these are kind of my thoughts. I'd love to see what you guys have to say about the current meta and what you guys think. Maybe I'm missing a deck. If you guys think a deck deserves to be up here, let me know. I'm interested in learning more about what's out there. So but this is kind of what I've been seeing and kind of reflects my testing with my friends and the people that I play with. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and of course, as always, like, subscribe, it helps the channel out. And yeah, let me know what you guys think of this video. This is kind of my first sort of ramble video. I tend to script things out a little bit more tightly. So I'm kind of curious if you guys like this. I'm trying to put more videos out. I wasn't able to put videos out before because I was busy with my own regionals and pre-releases and all that, but I'm trying to get back on the train. So that said, hope you guys enjoyed the video and see you guys next time. Peace.